Most people remember the sound before they remember the coin itself. A faint metallic tap, a penny sliding across a counter, the smallest unit of American money completing an ordinary transaction. The 1960 Lincoln 1-cent coin with a D-mint mark entered circulation quietly, without ceremony, and without any reason to draw attention to itself. And yet, decades later, it continues to occupy a particular corner of the American collecting mind. Not because it announces importance, but because it resists easy dismissal. By 1960, the Lincoln cent was already more than half a century old as a design. Abraham Lincoln's portrait had survived wars, economic upheavals, and dramatic changes in minting technology. It had become familiar to the point of invisibility. That familiarity is precisely what makes certain issues from this era complicated. When a coin is too common in appearance, it becomes harder to see what truly distinguishes one example from another. The Denver Mint in 1960 was operating at full efficiency. Demand for small change was high, and production numbers reflected that need. Cents were struck rapidly, shipped quickly, and expected to circulate immediately. Quality control existed, but speed mattered. Subtle variations were tolerated as long as coins met functional standards. No one at the time was thinking about long-term preservation, much less future scrutiny under magnification. This is where many misunderstandings begin. Newer collectors often assume that rarity must begin with low mintage or dramatic error. In reality, sustained collector interest often forms around more restrained qualities. Condition sensitivity, transitional mint practices, small differences that become visible only after decades of attrition, have removed most surviving examples from contention. The 1960D Lincoln cent exists in large numbers, but truly original, well-preserved pieces do not. Most were handled immediately. They were stored loosely in pockets, jars, drawers, and cash registers. Copper reacts to its environment, and the copper alloy used at the time was particularly vulnerable to fingerprints, moisture, and friction. What remains today is a population heavily skewed toward worn or altered surfaces. Collectors who study this issue closely understand that preservation is not simply about wear. It is about surface integrity, luster that has not been disturbed, color that has not been chemically shifted, strike quality that reflects the moment of production, rather than the cumulative effects of circulation. These attributes are difficult to assess casually, and that difficulty itself creates long-term interest. The year 1960 also sits at an inflection point in American coinage history. The nation was on the edge of significant economic and technological changes. The mint was experimenting with production efficiencies that would later become standard. Dies were pushed longer. Minor hub and die variations became more frequent. While none of this was publicly discussed at the time, it quietly shaped the coins that emerged. Collectors often overlook how psychology shapes survival. Coins that were immediately perceived as special were pulled aside. Coins that appeared ordinary were spent, saved without care, or forgotten. The 1960D cent fell into the second category. It did not signal importance. It did not announce scarcity. It simply existed, doing its job. That ordinariness is deceptive. Over time, coins like this become a kind of a mirror for the collecting community. They force difficult questions. How do we define quality when quantity is not the issue? How do we distinguish between age and preservation? At what point does commonness stop being a useful descriptor? Professional grading entered the picture long after these coins had already lived most of their lives. When third-party authentication became standard practice, it reframed how collectors evaluated mid-century cents. Instead of focusing on whether a coin was rare, attention shifted toward how well it had survived. Documentation, consistency and surface analysis became essential. This transition introduced another layer of complexity. Two coins struck on the same day from the same dies could follow completely different paths. One might remain untouched in a sealed roll. Another might circulate for decades. When they reappear in the modern market, they tell radically different stories, despite sharing the same date and mint mark. The Denver Mint's output in 1960 is particularly sensitive to this divergence. Strike pressure, blanket preparation, and die alignment varied subtly throughout the year. These differences are not dramatic. They matter to specialists. They affect how light interacts with the surface. They influence how details age. They determine whether a coin retains its original character or loses it. There is also the matter of expectation. Because so many 1960D cents exist, collectors often assume that high-quality examples must be easy to find. This assumption leads to disappointment and, occasionally, impatience. Coins are submitted for grading with unrealistic hopes. When results fall short, the issue itself is blamed rather than the realities of survival. Experienced collectors tend to approach this coin differently. They do not rush. They compare. They observe patterns over time. They understand that attention moves in cycles. Issues once ignored can become points of focus as broader collecting trends shift. Conversely, coins that dominate conversation for a decade can fade quietly into the background. The 1960D Lincoln cent benefits from this long view. It is stable in its identity. It does not rely on dramatic narratives. Its interest lies in wants, and wants ages well. As generations pass, fewer original examples remain unaltered. Cleaning, recoloring, and environmental damage steadily reduce the pool of coins that still reflect their moment of creation. This is where caution becomes essential. The desire to improve a coin's appearance has caused more harm than benefit. Altered surfaces may look appealing to an untrained eye, but they rarely withstand professional scrutiny. Documentation exists for a reason. Authentication is not about assigning value. It is about preserving trust in the historical record. Market attention when it arrives rarely does so evenly. One attribute becomes fashionable. A specific grade range draws focus. Then attention moves again. Collectors who endure these shifts tend to be those who never assumed permanence. They study history, not headlines. It is worth asking why coins like the 1960D cent continue to be discussed at all. The answer is not scarcity in the traditional sense. It is representativeness. This coin reflects how most American money was actually made and used. It embodies mass production, daily commerce, and quiet endurance. In that way, it is more honest than many celebrated rarities. Inheritance often brings these coins back into view. A box opened after decades. A jar poured onto a table. At first glance, nothing stands out. But time has a way of sharpening attention. Questions arise. Why do some pieces look different? Why do certain surfaces feel calmer, more settled? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They reward patience. The 1960D Lincoln cent does not reveal itself quickly. It asks to be examined, not admired. It invites context rather than excitement. In the end, understanding this coin is less about the coin itself and more about learning how to look, how to separate noise from signal, how to accept that importance is not always loud, that some objects are in their place not through drama, but through persistence. The cent remains what it has always been, small, familiar, easily overlooked. And yet, for those willing to slow down, it offers something rare in any field of collecting. A chance to study history not as a series of extraordinary events, as a continuous, quiet process, one coin at a time. There are moments in American coinage where nothing appears to be happening at all. No redesign, no national crisis, no public excitement. And yet, decades later, collectors find themselves quietly returning to those very years, asking why certain ordinary-looking coins continue to surface in serious conversations. The 1979 Lincoln, one set with the Denver Mint mark, belongs to that category. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. And that is precisely why it deserves a closer look. By 1979, the Lincoln set was already a familiar companion in American life. It had been in continuous production for 70 years, passing through wars, economic shifts, and cultural change. Most Americans in that period did not see the cent as a collectible at all. It was a tool of commerce, a pocket filler, something given and received without thought. And yet, within that ordinary year, within the massive output of the Denver Mint, subtle variables were introduced that would later become meaningful to patient collectors. The late 1970s were a transitional period for the United States Mint. Inflation had reshaped public attitudes toward money. Rising metal prices were already forcing discussions about the long-term practicality of low-denomination coinage. Mint facilities were under pressure to produce large quantities efficiently, often prioritizing speed and volume over fine visual detail. In Denver, where the 1970 90 cents were struck, production numbers were high, and quality control reflected the realities of that moment. At first glance, that might sound like a reason to dismiss the coin entirely. After all, abundance is usually the enemy of collectability. But experienced collectors know that high mintage does not automatically eliminate long-term interest. In fact, it can sometimes create a different kind of challenge. When millions of coins are produced quickly, subtle differences emerge. Dies wear down. Strike quality fluctuates. Small deviations occur, not as dramatic errors, but as quiet inconsistencies that only reveal themselves under careful study. The 1979 cent sits at an intersection of those factors. It is composed of the familiar bronze alloy, used before the major composition change of the early 1980s, giving it a physical and historical continuity that later cents would not share. That continuity matters more than it first appears. Collectors often respond not just to rarity, but to boundaries. Coins struck just before a major change often gain attention later because they represent the end of an era rather than the beginning of a new Denver minted cents from this period. Frequently show characteristics that challenge condition-focused collectors. Weak strikes in certain areas, especially in Lincoln's hair and the reverse lettering, are not uncommon. This means that finding examples with strong detail, full original luster, and minimal contact marks becomes progressively more difficult as grading standards rise. The difference between an average circulated piece and a sharply preserved example is not subtle. It is decisive. This is where misunderstandings often arise among newer collectors. Many assume that because a coin is common in circulation, high-quality examples must also be common. The reality is more complicated. Coins that circulated heavily in everyday commerce were exposed to handling, abrasion, and environmental factors almost immediately. Even coins that entered collections early were not always stored with long-term preservation in mind. As a result, truly well-preserved pieces from high mintage years can become surprisingly elusive over time. Professional grading has played a significant role in shaping how the 1979 cent is viewed today. Third-party certification did not dominate the hobby in 1979 the way it does now. Many coins from that era were saved casually, without documentation, without controlled storage. and without the expectation that condition would one day be evaluated with microscopic scrutiny. When such coins are submitted decades later, the results can surprise their owners, sometimes positively, sometimes not. Authentication and grading do more than assign numbers. They create records. They allow collectors to compare populations, track condition rarity, and observe how attention shifts over time. In the case of the 1979D cent, these records reveal an interesting pattern. While the coin itself is not scarce, the number of examples meeting the highest condition standards is far smaller than many would assume. That imbalance does not guarantee anything. That does invite sustained interest. There is also a psychological element at play. Collectors are often drawn to coins that require patience rather than impulse. The 1970-90 cent does not reward quick judgment. It asks the collector to slow down, to look closely, to understand context rather than chase headlines. For inheritors of old collections, this can be particularly important. Coins from the late 1970s are often overlooked in favor of earlier dates or more visibly dramatic pieces. Yet careful review sometimes reveals coins that were quietly set aside for reasons that are no longer obvious. Mint practices at Denver during this period further complicate the picture. Die life was extended aggressively, which can result in coins showing softer details, but also occasional die markers that specialists learn to recognize. These markers are not errors in the sensational sense, but they function as fingerprints, connecting individual coins to specific moments in the production process. For some collectors, that connection to the mint floor itself is where the real appeal lies. It is worth pausing to consider how market attention moves. Coins do not exist in isolation. They are affected by broader trends, generational shifts, and changes in collecting philosophy. What one generation ignores, another may reassess. The Lincoln Cent series has experienced several such reevaluations over the decades, often driven by research rather than speculation. As reference materials expand and data becomes more accessible, coins once considered unremarkable can gain new context. This does not mean that every 1970-90 cent deserves special treatment. Most do not, and that distinction matters. Mature collecting is as much about restraint as it is about enthusiasm. Understanding why certain examples draw attention requires accepting that most will not. Condition sensitivity, originality, and documentation all play roles that cannot be bypassed. There is also the matter of time itself. Coins age differently than expectations. A piece that seems plentiful today may quietly thin out tomorrow as collections are dispersed, damaged, or lost. Conversely, renewed interest can bring dormant examples back into view, altering perceptions once again. The cent has survived for more than a century precisely because it adapts to these cycles, both economically and culturally. For the experienced collector, the 1979D Lincoln cent offers a study in nuance. It encourages questions rather than answers. Why do some examples feel lifeless while others command attention under the same lighting? Why do certain surfaces retain vibrancy while others fade? What decisions were made at the mint that year? And how do they manifest decades later in the palm of a hand? For those reviewing inherited collections, the lesson is similar. Not every coin tells its story loudly. Some require context, comparison, and professional evaluation to be understood at all. Dismissing late-date cents outright can mean missing subtler narratives about production, preservation, and collector behavior. Ultimately, the value of studying coins like the 1979D cent is not found in conclusions, but in perspective. It reminds us that the hobby is built on observation, not assumption. That attention often arrives late, quietly and for reasons that only become clear in hindsight. And that patience, more than prediction, remains one of the most reliable tools a collector can possess as time continues to move forward. The 1979D Lincoln set will remain what it has always been, a small copper coin from a busy mint in a complicated era. Whether it attracts renewed focus or remains a footnote will depend not on headlines, but on the careful eyes of those willing to look beyond the obvious and ask why certain ordinary things refuse to be entirely forgotten. There is a certain kind of coin that almost never announces itself. It doesn't shimmer with obvious rarity, it isn't tied to a dramatic historical event, and it doesn't arrive wrapped in folklore. It sits quietly in albums, in drawers, in inherited boxes that haven't been opened in years. The 1996 Lincoln, one set with the D Mint mark, belongs to that category. And yet, for reasons that are easy to miss and difficult to fully explain, it continues to hold the attention of serious collectors who understand that significance is not always loud. To understand why. It helps to slow down and return to the mid-1990s. By 1996, the Lincoln set had already undergone one of the most consequential changes in its long history. The familiar copper composition had been replaced years earlier by a zinc core with a thin copper plating. The design itself was stable, almost conservative, and the coin was produced in enormous numbers. From a distance, it looked like a thoroughly modern, thoroughly ordinary cent. That appearance is precisely why many people stopped thinking about it too soon. The Denver Mint in 1996 was operating at full industrial efficiency. Automation was advanced, output was high, and quality control followed standardized tolerances that prioritized volume over perfection. Coins were struck rapidly, fed through high-speed presses, and released into circulation with little ceremony. This environment produced consistency, but it also produced subtle variation. Those variations, almost invisible at first glance, are where long-term collector interest tends to form. The 1996D cent is not a coin that commands attention because of scarcity in the traditional sense. There are plenty of them. What draws interest instead is condition sensitivity. This is a concept that newer collectors often misunderstand. They assume that if a coin is common, it must also be unimportant. Seasoned collectors know better. When millions of coins are produced, truly pristine survivors can become the exception rather than the rule. Most 1996D cents entered circulation immediately. They were stacked in bags, transported in bulk, and handled repeatedly before ever reaching a pocket. The copper plating on zinc cents is thin, and even minor contact can leave marks, distortions, or microscopic breaches that affect long-term stability. Over time, these small imperfections accumulate, and the number of coins that remain fully original, sharply struck, and free from surface issues becomes far smaller than the original mintage suggests. This is where patience enters the story. Coins like the 1996D Lincoln cent are rarely chased aggressively. Instead, they are studied, quietly set aside, and revisited over years or even decades. Collectors who focus on high-grade modern issues understand that demand often develops slowly. It emerges as registry competition grows, as grading standards evolve, and as fewer untouched examples remain available. There is also the question of strike quality. Not all 1996D cents were created equal. Die wear, alignment, and pressure varied throughout the year. Some coins exhibit strong, well-defined details in Lincoln's hair and beard, crisp lettering, and full separation in the wheat reverse lines where applicable in earlier eras, or in the memorial design details that remained standard at the time. Others appear softer, flatter, or slightly uneven, These differences matter deeply to those who look closely. Collectors who specialize in modern Lincoln cents often speak about quiet years, dates that don't attract headlines but consistently reward careful examination. The mid-1990s fall squarely into this category. They represent a transitional period between older collecting habits and the rise of modern third-party grading culture. Many coins from this era were saved casually, if at all, and fewer were preserved with the deliberate intent that later decades would bring. That historical timing creates an interesting tension. On one hand, the coins are not old enough to feel distant. On the other, they are far enough removed that original context has begun to fade. When collections are inherited, these cents are often overlooked in favor of earlier dates or visually striking pieces. They remain behind, unexamined, their potential determined less by excitement and more by scrutiny. Professional grading plays a role here, but not in the way it is sometimes portrayed. Authentication and grading are tools, not guarantees. They provide a standardized language that allows collectors to compare condition and originality across time and distance. For coins like the 1996D cent, grading becomes relevant only when the coin itself justifies the attention. Submitting an average example changes nothing. Identifying an exceptional one requires experience, restraint, and an understanding of what truly stands out. This is where collector psychology quietly shapes the market. Many people approach modern coins with preconceived expectations. They either assume there is hidden treasure everywhere or that nothing of interest exists at all. Both views miss the reality. Sustained collector interest is usually built on patterns, population data, survival rates, and the slow recognition of difficulty at the highest levels of preservation. It is also shaped by fatigue. Over time, collectors who chase only the obvious rarities often reach a point where competition becomes intense and opportunities narrow. At that stage, attention shifts. Eyes move toward areas where quality is harder to find, where patience still matters. Coins like the 1996D Lincoln cent begin to re-enter the conversation, not as surprises, but as case studies in how ordinary objects age into complexity. There is an understated lesson here about documentation. Original rolls, bank-wrapped packaging, and verifiable provenance can add context, even when they do not alter the coin itself. Knowing how a coin was stored, handled, or preserved can help explain why it survived in a particular state. This kind of information rarely makes headlines. It often influences serious evaluation. Another misconception worth addressing is the idea that attention, once gained, remains fixed. The coin market does not work that way. Interest flows. It responds to generational change, to new research, to shifting tastes. What is quietly studied today may be ignored tomorrow, and then rediscovered later under a different lens. Coins like the 1996D cent are well suited to this cycle because they do not depend on hype. To remain relevant as time passes, the context continues to evolve. Fewer untouched examples remain. More collections are dispersed. Standards subtly tighten. None of this happens dramatically. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day the conversation sounds different than it did before. The coin hasn't changed, but the way it is understood has. There is a moment many collectors recognize, usually years into the hobby, when they realize that the most interesting coins are not always the ones that shout. They are the ones that reward attention, the ones that invite questions rather than answers. The 1996 Lincoln 1 cent from the Denver Mint fits comfortably into that category. It asks quiet questions. How many truly pristine examples still exist? How many were set aside unknowingly, and how many were lost to ordinary use? How will future collectors view the late 20th century? A period often dismissed as too recent to matter? These are not questions that demand immediate resolution. They are questions that unfold over time. In the end, the value of studying a coin like this is not found in predictions. It is found in perspective. Understanding how history, manufacturing, and human behavior intersect gives depth to even the most familiar objects. The 1996D Lincoln set reminds us that significance does not require drama. Sometimes it requires patience, curiosity, and the willingness to look again at what seemed already understood. And perhaps that is why it continues to be quietly set aside, examined under better light, and reconsidered by those who know that the story of American coinage is not only written in its rarest chapters, but also in its most ordinary pages. Time does its work slowly, and meaning accumulates almost without notice. Most people would never remember the moment a 1997 Lincoln 1-cent coin passed through their hands. It would have arrived quietly, without ceremony, already worn smooth by countless transactions, already indistinguishable from the pennies that came before and after it. And yet, among experienced collectors, the 1997 Lincoln cent, particularly those struck at the Denver Mint, has earned a reputation, not through spectacle, but through persistence. It is a coin that rewards patience, attention, and restraint. The kind of coin that does not announce itself, waits not to understand why. It helps to step back into the late 1990s. The United States was in a period of relative economic stability. Coinage production was efficient, highly mechanized, and focused on volume rather than nuance. Pennies were not treated as historical artifacts. They were consumables. The Denver Mint alone produced billions of Lincoln cents in 1997, operating at a pace designed to meet circulation demand, not collector scrutiny. In that environment, small details mattered less than speed, and consistency was assumed rather than verified. This assumption is where many misunderstandings begin. Collectors, new to modern cents, often believe rarity must announce itself through low mintage figures or dramatic mint errors. But the Lincoln cent series has long demonstrated a different truth. Some of the most persistently studied coins are not scarce in number, but scarce in condition. The 1997D cent exists in enormous quantities. Yet truly well-preserved examples are far less common than raw production numbers suggest. This contradiction has quietly shaped collector behavior for decades. By 1997, the Lincoln cent was composed primarily of zinc with a thin copper plating, a change introduced years earlier, but still not fully appreciated by the public. This composition, while cost-effective, introduced new vulnerabilities. The copper layer is thin enough that even minor contact, improper storage, or humidity can permanently alter the coin's surface. Blisters, bubbling, and microscopic breaches can develop long before obvious corrosion appears. In circulation, these flaws are almost inevitable. Even in rolls, they are common. As a result, the difference between an average 1997D cent and a carefully preserved one is not obvious at first glance. It reveals itself slowly, under magnification, in the uniformity of the fields, the sharpness of Lincoln's profile, and the clarity of the mint mark. Collectors who have spent years examining these coins learn to notice what others overlook. They notice strike quality, blanket preparation, and subtle die characteristics that hint at when and how the coin was produced. The Denver Mint in 1997 was under pressure to maintain output levels, and that pressure has consequences. Dies were used extensively. Blankets were fed rapidly. Quality control existed, but it was designed to prevent major defects. not to ensure numismatic perfection. This means that a fully struck, clean, and undisturbed 1997D cent represents a narrower slice of production than most people realize. Not rare in the dramatic sense, but selectively uncommon in the sense that matters to long-term collectors. There is also the matter of timing. The late 1990s occupy an unusual space in modern U.S. coinage history. They are recent enough to feel familiar, yet distant enough that original storage practices are often undocumented. Many collections assembled during that period were casual. Coins were placed in jars, envelopes, or basic holders without consideration for long-term preservation. When those collections resurface often through inheritance, the coins tell a story, not just of minting, but of neglect, movement, and exposure. This is where professional grading enters the conversation, though not as a promise and not as a shortcut. Experienced collectors understand that third-party grading is a tool, not a verdict. Authentication and encapsulation provide a standardized reference point, but they do not create quality where it does not exist. For a coin like the 1997D cent, grading becomes meaningful only when the coin already demonstrates exceptional characteristics. Most do not, and that reality is precisely what sustains interest in the few that do. Another misconception is that market attention follows logic. In practice, it follows narratives. Sometimes those narratives are built around key dates or varieties. Other times, they emerge from broader trends, renewed interest in Lincoln cents, shifts in registry participation, or generational changes in collecting priorities. Coins like the 1997D often sit quietly through these cycles, neither rising dramatically nor disappearing from discussion. They persist in auction archives, grading population reports, and private want lists. Why would a collector care about a coin that is so common in theory? The answer lies in psychology. Collectors are not only historians, they are caretakers of standards. They seek benchmarks that define what excellence looks like within a series. A pristine, sharply struck 1997D set challenges assumptions about modern coinage. It forces a reevaluation of what common truly means. And it invites comparison between mints, between years, and between the expectations of the public and the realities of production. There is also a generational element. Collectors who were active in the 1990s are now the stewards of their own histories. The coins of that era are no longer contemporary objects. They are artifacts of a specific moment in American manufacturing and economic culture. As time passes, context accumulates. A coin once dismissed as unremarkable becomes a reference point, a marker of transition, or a case study in material science, and mass production. Soft questions naturally arise. How many untouched examples truly remain? How many were lost to circulation before anyone thought to care? How many sit unnoticed, misidentified, or improperly stored? These questions do not demand immediate answers. In fact, their lack of resolution is part of what sustains interest. They keep collectors looking, comparing, and revisiting coins they thought they understood. It is worth noting that sustained attention does not always correlate with market excitement. Some coins are studied extensively without ever becoming fashionable. Others experience brief surges before fading again. The 1997D cent has avoided both extremes. Its presence is steady, almost quiet, anchored by its role within the broader Lincoln cent narrative. It is a coin that invites long observation rather than speculation. Documentation plays an important role here. Provenance, original packaging, and verifiable storage histories can add layers of interest, even when they do not alter a coin's technical assessment. A 1997D set preserved in original mint rolls, or traced through a single collection since issuance, tells a different story than one pulled from circulation decades later. Neither story is inherently better, but each adds texture to the coin's identity. Collectors who have spent years with this series often caution against impatience. Modern scents teach restraint. They reward those who study surfaces, who understand mint practices, and who accept that significance is not always immediate. The market does not move on a schedule, and attention does not distribute itself evenly. Coins wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. As the Lincoln cent continues its long journey through American history. Coins like the 1997D remain quietly present. They do not demand attention, but they hold it when given. They remind us that collecting is not only about discovery, but about perception, about learning to see what was always there. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. In a world where so much competes for notice, the 1997 Lincoln 1 cent coin from the Denver Mint stands as a study in understatement. It asks very little of the observer except time, patience, and a willingness to look closer than before. At first glance, it is the kind of coin most people never pause to notice. A copper-colored, cent-dated 2000, familiar in weight, familiar in sound, often passed along without a second thought. No special mint mark catches the eye. No dramatic design change announces its presence. And yet, within American numismatics, some of the most enduring stories begin exactly this way, with coins that appear ordinary, until time, context, and careful observation begin to change how they are seen. The year 2000 marked a psychological threshold in the United States. It was not just the beginning of a new millennium, but the culmination of decades of economic expansion, technological optimism, and cultural confidence. The Lincoln 1 cent struck that year without a mint mark was produced at the Philadelphia Mint, continuing a tradition that stretched back more than 2 centuries. By the numbers, it was a high mintage issue, the kind often dismissed by newer collectors as too common to matter. But experienced collectors know that mintage alone rarely tells the full story. The 2000 Lincoln cent exists at an intersection of history and habit. It was produced during a period when the cent itself was increasingly questioned, its purchasing power diminished, its future uncertain, its role in everyday commerce quietly shrinking. And when an object begins to feel obsolete, the way it is handled changes. Coins are stored less carefully. They circulate longer. They suffer more contact, more abrasion, more indifference. Over time, truly pristine examples become scarcer not because fewer were made, but because fewer were preserved. That distinction is subtle. It matters. The obverse design, bearing Victor David Brenner's familiar portrait of Abraham Lincoln, remained unchanged from the late 20th century style. Yet the metal composition, a copper-plated zinc core introduced in the early 1980s, continued to pose challenges. These cents are vulnerable in ways earlier copper issues were not. Tiny disruptions in the plating process, often invisible at a glance, can lead to blistering, peeling, or corrosion years later. A coin that looks acceptable today may reveal flaws decades down the line, especially if stored improperly. Collectors who have spent enough time with modern cents understand that condition sensitivity is everything. The difference between a coin that is merely uncirculated and one that qualifies as a top-tier example can hinge on microscopic details. The sharpness of Lincoln's cheek, the clarity of the date, the uninterrupted luster across the fields. For the 2000 no-mint mark cent, these details are not dramatic, but they are unforgiving. One of the quiet misunderstandings among newer collectors is the assumption that modern coins are easy to find and high grade because they are recent. In reality, the opposite is often true. Modern coins are overhandled precisely because they are perceived as unimportant. They are stacked, rolled, machine counted, and stored in ways that would never be tolerated for older issues. As a result, population reports from professional grading services often show steep drop-offs at the highest grade levels. This is where collector psychology begins to play its role. Seasoned collectors tend to move in cycles. Interest drifts from classic silver to early copper, then to errors, then back to overlooked modern issues. These shifts are rarely predictable and almost never announced in advance. They are shaped by registry competition, academic publications, auction results, and sometimes by a single well-documented example that reframes an entire issue. The 2000 Lincoln set without a mint mark has quietly benefited from this pattern, not through sudden excitement, but through steady reassessment. There is also the matter of documentation. Coins from this era sit at the edge of analog and digital record keeping. Mint practices were well standardized, but not yet exhaustively archived online in the way they would be a decade later. Small anomalies, die deterioration, minor hub variations, subtle strike differences exist, but they require careful study to confirm. Professionals approach these details cautiously, aware that overinterpretation can be as misleading as neglect. Authentication and grading, when applied neutrally and conservatively, serve less as endorsements and more as historical snapshots. A certified coin represents a moment in time, a consensus opinion rendered under specific standards. Those standards evolve. What was considered exceptional 20 years ago may be reevaluated today, not because the coin changed, but because the framework around it did. This is why experienced collectors resist drawing hard conclusions from any single data point. The Philadelphia Mint in 2000 was operating at a scale that prioritized efficiency over finesse. Dies were pushed to their limits. Quality control focused on volume, not perfection. In that environment, sharply struck. Fully lustrous scent is less a product of intention than of circumstance. When one appears, it invites questions. How was it handled? Where was it stored? Why did it survive when so many others did not? These questions are not rhetorical. They guide serious collecting. Another layer of misunderstanding surrounds the phrase "no mint mark." To the uninitiated, it sounds special. To professionals, it simply indicates origin. Philadelphia's cents historically lacked mint marks, and their presence or absence must be interpreted within context. The significance is never inherent. It is earned through rarity, demand, and scholarly interest. The 2000 no mint mark cent does not demand attention. It waits for it. And waiting is something the cent has done well. As the years pass. Attrition does its work quietly. Coins are lost, damaged, spent, melted, or discarded. Collections are broken up. Estates are dispersed. What remains is shaped less by intention than by chance. Over time, patterns emerge that were never planned. Certain dates become unexpectedly difficult to locate in top condition. Others flood the market. The reasons are rarely obvious and often debated. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the hobby. It is its foundation. For inheritors reviewing old collections, the temptation is to search for immediate answers, to sort quickly, to label decisively, to reduce complexity into categories of valuable and not. But coins like the 2000 Lincoln cent resist that approach. Their significance, if any, lies not in dramatic rarity, but in incremental distinction. They reward patience, documentation, and restraint. It is also worth acknowledging that not every coin with collector interest will ever command widespread attention. Some remain footnotes, studied by specialists, appreciated quietly, then set aside. Others resurface years later, recontextualized by new research or shifting tastes. There is no formula that predicts which path a coin will follow. What can be said with confidence is that sustained collector attention is rarely driven by hype. It grows out of consistency, out of shared observation, out of a slow alignment between supply and demand. Coins that endure tend to do so because they invite continued study, not because they promise conclusions. The 2000 Lincoln one cent without a mint mark is not an answer. It is a question. A small, unassuming artifact from a moment when the country stood at a symbolic threshold, unaware of how quickly circumstances would change. It reflects a minting philosophy focused on utility, a public increasingly detached from small denominations, and a collector community that would later begin to look back with more nuance. For those willing to look closely, it offers a reminder that significance in numismatics is often cumulative, built from details, from context, from time, and sometimes from coins that everyone thought they already understood. In the end, the most important thing to remember is not what a coin might become, but what it already is. A physical record of choices made, standards applied, and histories lived through circulation. Whether studied, certified, or simply preserved, the 2000 Lincoln cent stands as part of that ongoing record, quiet, patient, and unresolved.
Imagine holding a single coin in the palm of your hand, a coin that could instantly transform your life. One small, unassuming piece of copper, minted over 6 decades ago, quietly sitting in a dusty drawer or an old coin album. Most people would see it as just another penny, but there's a broken bar. This is not just any penny. This is the 1961 Lincoln 1 cent, a coin whose story has captivated collectors, investors, and dreamers alike. Today, one of these rare coins can fetch close to $1 million. Yes, $1 million for a coin smaller than a quarter, thinner than a dime. Now, before you rush to your drawer or wallet, let's take a journey back to 1961. The United States was on the brink of transformation. The Kennedy administration was inspiring hope. The nation was bustling with post-war optimism, and the penny, with Abraham Lincoln's solemn profile, was quietly circulating in every pocket, every purse, every cash register. But hidden among millions of ordinary pennies minted that year at the Denver Mint, a few held a secret, a flaw, a rarity, a perfect storm of numismatic destiny. Here's where it gets fascinating. Most 1961 pennies were mass-produced, millions upon millions, but a handful were struck with such precision or perhaps such luck that they escaped commonality entirely. Collectors today call them the $1 million pennies, not because of gold or silver content, but because of rarity, history, and the sheer thrill of ownership. Imagine a coin so rare that holding it is like holding a fragment of history itself. It's no exaggeration to say that owning one instantly elevates you to a select class, a level where wealth meets legend. Now, I know what you're thinking, a penny? Seriously? But here's the truth. Pennies have a hidden world, a world that most people overlook. It's a world where small mistakes become immense treasures. One minor variation in the die, one tiny misalignment, can make a coin go from pocket change to financial freedom. In the case of the 1961 Lincoln penny, a specific combination of die wear, minting pressure, and sheer chance created coins that today sell for hundreds of thousands or sometimes millions of dollars. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why the same object can be worthless to one person and priceless to another? It's a reminder that value is not always in the object itself, but in perception, history, and rarity. And in this case, Rarity is everything, because while millions of 1961D pennies exist, only a few hold the precise characteristics that make them the unicorns of coin collecting. And here's a question that will make you double-check your drawers. Could you be sitting on $1 million coin without even knowing it? It sounds crazy, but it's not impossible. In fact, some collectors have stumbled upon these treasures in the most ordinary of places: a forgotten album, a box of old coins inherited from a grandparent, or even a drawer of spare change left behind for decades. The thrill of discovery is electric, almost cinematic, and once you find one, the clock starts ticking, because collectors around the world are always searching, always bidding, and the market doesn't wait. But let's back up for a moment and understand what makes the 1961D Lincoln penny so extraordinary. It starts with the mint mark, the tiny D beneath Lincoln's bust. That D signifies Denver, and it's more than just a location. It represents a minting process that produced fewer coins with this rare characteristic, and even fewer that survived unscathed. Combine that with the condition of the coin, its luster, its strike quality, its lack of wear, and suddenly, you're holding something that transcends ordinary currency. Collectors, investors, and historians alike are drawn to these coins not just for their monetary value, but for the story they tell. Every scratch, every mark, every gleaming copper surface is a testament to decades of survival. They've witnessed history, the turbulence of the 1960s, the rise of modern America, countless hands that pass them by, until finally, they rest in the hands of someone who recognizes their true worth. Now, here's a little secret most people don't know. The market for rare coins moves fast. Yesterday's curiosity can become today's million-dollar auction. One misstep, one delay, and a fortune could slip through your fingers. And yet, for those who understand, who know what to look for, the opportunity is exhilarating. This isn't just buying or selling, it's participating in history, in legacy, in wealth that grows not through stocks or bonds, but through rarity, demand, and timing. Let's inject a little humor here, because even in the world of million-dollar pennies, you've got to laugh. Imagine telling a friend, "I just sold my penny for $1 million," and watching their face when they realize you're not joking. That disbelief is priceless, and in that moment, you understand the magic of coins, the way something small can hold immense power. So, what does this mean for you? If you own old pennies, especially 1961D Lincoln cents, the stakes are high. Don't let them sit unnoticed. Don't assume their value is what the pocket change of today suggests. Every scratch, every patina, every demon mark could be the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. And for those who act decisively, who recognize the signs, the rewards are life-changing. But let me be clear, this is not a guarantee. Not every 1961D penny will fetch millions. Some are common, some show wear, some were struck differently. The key is knowing what to look for, the subtle variations, the alignment, the sharpness of Lincoln's features, the precise strike of the Denver D. It's a meticulous art, a detective story, and the reward is a seat at the table of history and wealth. And here's the cliffhanger. Even experts are still discovering new specimens, coins thought to be lost forever suddenly appearing in unexpected places. That could be your jar of pennies, your inherited collection, your hidden treasure. The question is, will you recognize it when you see it? Will you act before the opportunity passes? Because in the world of rare coins, hesitation is the enemy, and action is the ultimate currency. As we conclude this journey, one truth stands out: the 1961D Lincoln penny is more than copper and metal. It is history, it is rarity, it is potential, it is proof that wealth can hide in plain sight, that opportunity often comes disguised as the mundane. For those who seek, who study, who act, The rewards are monumental, and for those who hesitate a broken bar, well, let's just say, someone else will be the one holding the $1 million penny, sipping their coffee, and smiling at the sheer luck of history's alignment. So, take a moment, check your drawers, examine those old albums, and imagine the possibilities, because the next 1961 Lincoln penny you find could be the coin that changes your life forever. And remember, history doesn't wait, the market doesn't wait, and opportunity favors the bold.
Most people remember the sound of loose change in a pocket. It is ordinary, reassuring, almost invisible. And yet, history has a way of hiding in ordinary places. The 1985 Lincoln 1 cent with a Denver Mint mark is one of those coins that rarely announces itself. It does not demand attention. It waits. And for many collectors, that quiet presence is precisely what makes it worth a closer look. In 1985, the United States was in the middle of a transition that most Americans never noticed. Inflation fears from the late 1970s had cooled, the economy was stabilizing, and the U.S. Mint was operating at high efficiency. Coinage was no longer experimental or scarce. Pennies flowed in massive quantities through banks, grocery stores, and payroll envelopes. To most people, a Lincoln cent of that year was disposable, something to be spent and forgotten. That assumption shaped its entire journey. The Denver Mint struck hundreds of millions of 1 cent coins in 1985. Production was fast, standardized, and focused on volume rather than perfection. By that point, the Lincoln cent had already undergone its most significant material change. Since 1982, cents were no longer primarily copper, but a zinc core plated with a thin layer of copper. This change simplified production, but introduced a new sensitivity that collectors would only fully understand years later. At the time, no one at the Mint was thinking about how these coins would age over decades in circulation. The emphasis was on consistency, speed, and meeting demand. Dies were used aggressively, sometimes well past their ideal lifespan. Minor die deterioration, soft details, and uneven strikes were not unusual, especially at Denver, where output demands were high. None of this was considered problematic. After all, these were coins meant to move quickly through the economy. That context matters, because modern collectors often approach the 1985 cent with assumptions borrowed from earlier eras. They expect rarity to announce itself clearly through low mintages or dramatic errors. But coins like this one operate on a different psychological plane. Their appeal is not rooted in immediate scarcity. It is rooted in condition, survival, and the slow filtering effect of time. Most 1985 cents entered circulation immediately and stayed there. They were scraped across counters, dropped into jars, exposed to moisture, heat, and friction. The copper plating, already thin, proved vulnerable. Microscopic breaches allowed the zinc core to react with air and moisture, leading to bubbling, discoloration, and eventual corrosion. Once that process begins, it cannot be reversed. The coin's surface integrity is permanently altered. As a result, truly well-preserved examples became less common than many people expected. Not rare in an absolute sense, but uncommon in the specific ways that matter to experienced collectors. Full original luster, sharp strike detail in Lincoln's hair and beard, clean fields free of carbon spotting, and intact copper plating are harder to find today than the original mintage numbers would suggest. This is where newer collectors often misunderstand the coin. They look at production figures and assume abundance equals insignificance. But seasoned collectors know that high mintage does not guarantee high survival in top condition. In fact, coins produced in enormous numbers are often treated with the least care. They are saved less frequently, mishandled more casually, and exposed to harsher environments. Over time, that neglect becomes a kind of unintentional filter. Another layer of complexity comes from the Denver Mint's striking characteristics in the mid-1980s. Many 1985 descents show subtle weakness in certain design elements. The date may appear slightly soft, Lincoln's jawline less defined, or the reverse lettering not fully squared. These traits are not errors. They are artifacts of production speed and die wear. Yet when a coin emerges that does not show these weaknesses, collectors notice. Professional grading has played a quiet but important role in shaping modern attention. Around this issue, third-party grading services do not assign value. They document condition, but documentation itself changes behavior. When collectors see how few examples achieve the highest condition designations, perceptions shift. Coins once dismissed as common begin to be re-examined, not because their history changed, but because understanding deepened. Is also a psychological element at work. The 1985D set sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. It is too modern to feel antique, yet old enough to no longer feel familiar to younger collectors. It is not tied to a major design change or historical crisis. And precisely because of that, it tends to be overlooked during periods of speculative enthusiasm. Attention moves elsewhere, toward flashier stories. Markets, including collector markets, are cyclical. What is ignored in one decade may be studied carefully in the next. Often, that shift begins quietly among specialists who notice patterns others miss. They notice how few pristine examples remain. They notice how often certain surface issues appear. They notice how condition rarity, not mintage, defines long-term collector interest. The 1985 descent also serves as a reminder of how documentation matters. Original rolls, sealed bags, and verifiable provenance can influence how a coin is perceived, even if the coin itself is unchanged. Authentication and grading provide a common language, a way for collectors to compare notes across time and geography. Without that shared framework, many coins would remain permanently misunderstood. There is a temptation, especially among those newly inheriting collections, to search for dramatic conclusions, to ask whether a coin is special or not, valuable or not, worth attention or not. Coins like the 1985D resist that kind of binary thinking. They exist on a spectrum. Their significance depends on nuance, strike quality, surface preservation, storage history, and documentation. It is also worth acknowledging that not every example deserves intense scrutiny. Most circulated 1985D cents are exactly what they appear to be: heavily used, environmentally compromised, and common in lower grades. Recognizing that reality is part of responsible collecting, discernment matters more than optimism, and yet dismissing the entire issue would be a mistake. Coins are historical artifacts, but they are also survivors. Each one that remains intact decades later tells a story of how it was treated or not treated by the people who handled it. In that sense, condition is a form of biography. It reflects human behavior as much as mint practice. Collector attention over the long term tends to gravitate toward these quieter stories. Not overnight, not predictably, but steadily. The coins that reward patience are rarely the ones that shout the loudest. They are the ones that endure scrutiny without collapsing under it. As time passes, fewer untouched examples of everyday coinage remain. Jars are emptied, estates are dispersed, and environmental damage continues its slow work. The population of well-preserved coins does not increase. It only diminishes or stabilizes. That reality, more than any headline or rumor, is what sustains long-term interest. The 1985 Lincoln, 1 cent from the Denver Mint, stands as a case study in this process. It reminds collectors that history does not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it whispers, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Understanding that difference is part of what separates accumulation from true collecting. In the end, the coin does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. And for those willing to approach it with calm attention rather than expectation, it offers something quieter but more enduring: perspective.